My name is Ken Spector with LivingECO.com, and I'm on the phone today with Sarah Janssen once again. And Sarah Janssen is a senior scientist at Natural Resources Defense Council. Hey, Sarah, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you. And for those who don't know, or for those who didn't listen to the other interview that I did with you on bisphenol A, what is the NRDC?
We are the Natural Resources Defense Council. We are a large, nonprofit, non-governmental environmental organization, and I'm a part of the health team, the health and environment team at NRDC, and we work on a wide range of issues ranging from children's health to contaminants in food, sustainable ag, air pollutants, and my focus has been primarily on endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Last time we spoke, we discussed a chemical called bisphenol A, or BPA, which is found in many canned food and canned drink liners. And more recently, since I last spoke with you, I learned that it was found on store receipts, on our monetary currency, and even in the air. Do you have a quick update on BPA studies and legislation since October of 2009?
Yeah, there's actually been quite a bit happening on BPA. There's always new science coming out. It's actually really hard to keep up with. I think there's a couple new studies every week. The studies continue to raise concerns about the impacts of BPA exposure, especially for young children and developing babies in the womb. We continue to see impacts, especially on increased risk for mammary or breast cancer later in life. And some of the new studies that are coming out are really concerning for the impacts of BPA on the development of conditions which are really quite prevalent in our society, and those are things like diabetes and obesity. It continues to be a concern. The good news is that a lot of the things I think that we probably talked about a couple of years ago are no longer as much of a concern. And in fact, BPA is no longer being used in baby bottles and sippy cups. And that's a huge victory. And it's in large part due to at least 10 states that have banned BPA for those uses, baby bottles and sippy cups. California was one of the most recent ones to do that in 2011. And I think also in part because a lot of parents raised really big concerns and demanded to have BPA-free alternatives available on the store shelves. So all the major retailers many years ago shifted away from using BPA. And the FDA has formally indicated that BPA is no longer allowed to be used for baby bottles and sippy cups. So we don't have to worry about it making a reappearance. And that's good news. However, there are still a lot of places where we can find BPA. The other good news seems to be that infant formula packaging no longer contains BPA. Again, for many of the same reasons that BPA was removed from baby bottles, it was taken out of infant formula packaging. Parents raised a lot of concerns about it. Retailers moved towards using BPA-free infant formula packaging. And there has been a petition filed at the FDA by Representative Ed Markey of Massachusetts asking the FDA to formally withdraw approval of BPA in infant formula packaging, which the FDA has indicated that they will do because all of the major infant formula makers have indicated they no longer use BPA in their packaging. So that's another great victory that's happened. But, for most of us, the biggest source of exposure remains canned food, and all canned food products, including canned beverage products, canned sodas and beers, are legally allowed to use BPA in their packaging. But just like what happened with the baby bottles and infant formula is happening with the canned food manufacturers, many of them have indicated that they are going to be BPA-free. So, for example, Campbell's Soup just in the last year indicated that they are going to remove BPA from their canned food packaging. A number of tomato manufacturers have taken BPA out of their linings. And I think you're probably going to start seeing BPA-free labels on canned food because people have indicated that they don't want BPA in their can linings. So that's all great, and I think we're going to see a shift in the marketplace away from BPA. However, I want to caution your listeners that just because something is BPA-free doesn't mean that it's safe. For many of the alternatives, we don't even know what the replacement is. I found out many years after I quit using my BPA-free baby bottles that my baby bottles that I fed my daughter with were made with a different chemical called bisphenol S, so BPS instead of BPA. They're chemical cousins. BPS is like BPA, an estrogen-like chemical. However, it's been hardly studied at all, so we don't really know what the health impacts are of that chemical. But I think it's just the real cautionary assured that the BPA-free products we're buying are necessarily safe, and that the consumer still has to be on the watch and trying to pick the least toxic alternative, which for baby bottles is glass, and for food is really to avoid eating canned food and try to eat things that are more fresh and less processed. I think we're fortunate in California that we can do that almost year-round.
So, BPA, we go from one toxic chemical to another series of toxic chemicals, fire retardants. Sarah, what are fire retardants, and why should we be concerned?
Flame retardant or fire retardant chemicals, you hear that phrase and it sounds like a positive thing. Nobody wants to have a fire in their home or in their workplace, and these chemicals were well-intentioned as things that have been added especially to upholstered furniture to prevent a fire from spreading. They don't actually prevent a fire from happening, but they're supposed to slow down the rate of a fire so that you have time to escape. The problem is that these chemicals actually don't just stay in the furniture. They migrate out of the furniture, and they've been shown to enter our bodies. And they actually don't even really work to prevent fires. So we're being exposed unnecessarily to some chemicals which are actually pretty toxic.
What are the history of fire retardants, and also what is the relationship between the tobacco industry and fire retardant use?
Yeah, there was quite a provocative investigative series that was done this summer by the Chicago Tribune, which revealed a lot of associations and links between the flame retardant chemical industry and the tobacco industry. I really encourage everyone to read that. I think it was reprinted in full in the LA Times. But the short version is that in lieu of using fire-safe cigarettes, those are self-extinguishing cigarettes, the tobacco companies worked hand in hand with the chemical companies to promote the use of flame retardant chemicals in upholstered furniture. Their argument was rather than going after the source, which was the cigarette, we should be going after the fuel, which is the petroleum-based foam that's found in couches. And so they waged a decades-long campaign based on deception and creating doubt in the science around the toxicity of these chemicals to promote their use in upholstered furniture, not just in California, but actually it's resulted in couches and chairs and all kinds of upholstered furniture across the country being treated with pounds of these chemicals, many of which have been linked to cancer and other kinds of harm in humans, including infants and young children.
We saw with BPA that initially the chemical was used as an estrogen replacement for women briefly, and then migrated into plastics, and was later deemed by many scientists to be toxic for humans and other living creatures. Now we're talking about fire retardants. Why are all of these chemicals not put through rigorous testing by the EPA before they're introduced into our furniture, our carpets, and our curtains?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think something that a lot of people assume has happened and actually doesn't happen. And in large part, it's due to weaknesses in the federal law that is intended to regulate all chemicals that aren't being used as pesticides or pharmaceuticals. And that law is called the Toxic Substances Control Act. We abbreviate that as TSCA. And TSCA was a landmark environmental law that was passed in the mid-1970s, along with all the other major environmental laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. But unlike those laws, which have been effective at reducing exposure and cleaning up our air and our water, TSCA has been largely a failure because it is such a weak law, and also it's never actually been updated or reformed since the 1970s when it was first passed. And of course, our scientific knowledge has increased vastly on the toxicity of these chemicals since the law was first passed. And just to give you one example of how weak this law is, I think all of us would agree that asbestos is a pretty bad chemical. It's been linked to, of course, many types of cancer, and I don't think that there's anyone who would argue that asbestos is something that's safe. And the law is so weak that there actually are remaining legal uses of asbestos in the United States because TSCA has been unable to fully ban all uses. So when it comes to chemicals like phthalates and BPA and the flame retardants, you can sort of understand why some of these really bad chemicals haven't been banned. And further, the law is so weak, most chemicals have been introduced into the marketplace with very little to no chemical testing being done to assess their toxicity. And that's why we play this game of always replacing one bad chemical with another bad chemical, often without a lot of knowledge about how bad it is until much later after it's been widely put into use. NRDC and a number of other groups that are a part of the Safer Chemicals Healthy Families Coalition have been working really hard the last couple of years to update TSCA through legislation that's been introduced by Senator Frank Lautenberg. It's called the Safe Chemicals Act. And I encourage you to learn more about that legislation at saferchemicals.org, which is the website. And you can sign up to be a friend on Facebook or follow us on Twitter and learn more about what we're doing to update that legislation, which is really the crux of the problem for why BPA gets replaced by BPS or PBDEs, which are one class of flame retardants, get replaced by another flame retardant that's also known to cause cancer.
And here's another problem. I read that the chemical industry spent at least $23.2 million over the past 5 years to lobby California officials and donate to campaigns in an effort to defeat legislation. How are we allowing this to happen?
Yeah, that did happen in California, where the last 5 years, NRDC and other groups based in California have been working to update our flammability standards, which would lessen the need for all these chemicals to be added to our furniture. And the chemical industry really waged quite a battle and spent a lot of money to try to defeat those bills, and they were successful. One of the things that came out in the Chicago Tribune series was that they brought in physicians who were burn doctors to talk about how flame retardants save lives. And that testimony that was given by those doctors was actually false. The fires and the kids that they described who were either killed or suffered greatly because of burns from the fires didn't actually exist. And so they really waged a very deceptive and deep-pocketed campaign to prevent any updates to the flammability standards in California, including things like just exempting breastfeeding cushions and bassinet cushions and strollers from having to be treated with flame retardant chemicals. I mean, these are products that are just not fire hazards, but they fought it all tooth and nail. And I think those tactics have been exposed, and it's going to make those efforts to defeat any future legislation in California very difficult. How has it happened? Well, I think it goes back to our weak laws on campaign financing and who can donate to candidates and how much money they can spend to influence their vote, which is a really unfortunate situation that's not unique to California, but it's happening across the country.
Amazing. I bought a sofa about 12 years ago, and in my research, I realized that there was something called TB 117, Technical Bulletin 117, and I immediately went over, I pulled up a cushion, I looked at the sofa, and it said right on there, this sofa complies with TB 117. Should I be getting rid of my sofa?
Yeah, I have one of those sofas too, and that's the dilemma, right? What do we do with these toxic couches? I actually had my couch tested. I bought my couch in 2007, and I had the foam tested and found that it contains a chemical called chlorinated tris, or TDCPP. That chemical was just added to the Prop 65 list as a chemical known to cause cancer. So I have carcinogens, pounds of carcinogens in my couch, and I'd love to get rid of it and buy a new couch. But the problem is that as we get rid of one group of bad flame retardants and then it gets replaced with another, and that one's now almost all couches in California, if they contain this TDCPP chemical, would probably have to be labeled with a Prop 65 label, that thing that says this product or this couch contains chemicals known to the state of California to cause cancer. So no manufacturer is going to want to label their couch that way, so they're going to replace tris with some other chemical, probably an untested chemical, which we're going to find out later on contains chemicals that are carcinogens or known to interfere with hormones in the body or interfere with brain development. So I don't feel like at this point I can go out and buy a new couch. It might be PBDE free, it might be tris free, but is it going to be free of toxic flame retardants? Probably not. To get at the heart of this matter, we have to change the standard. We don't really want safer chemicals. We want a standard that actually is effective and doesn't require us to have pounds of chemicals in our couch foam. And that's because TB117 is not really effective. It's a flammability standard for the foam, not for the fabric covering the foam, which is where most fires start, is in the fabric, not in the foam. And California is in the process of updating TB117. The new standard is going to be called TB117-2012. And that standard is going to be a fabric-based standard that's going to be based on the cause of most fires, which are smoldering cigarettes. So it's going to be a smolder standard for the fabric that covers the foam. And that is going to result in our furniture not having to be treated with pounds of chemicals to meet the new standard. And so the good news is that you and I can get rid of our couches probably in about a year and buy couches in California that aren't treated or don't have to be treated with all of these toxic chemicals.
So it will be elective in terms of the companies determining whether they want to put the fire retardant in their sofa or not? Is that how that's going to work?
Yeah, and we understand that most of the furniture companies will elect not to because there's no reason for them to put toxic chemicals in their couch. And consumers like you and I are going to demand that we have chemical-free couches. The new standard for the fabric can be met without adding chemicals to the fabric or the foam. And so it's actually going to save the manufacturers costs because they aren't going to have to put extra chemicals into their furniture. And the question, I think, for you and I is what are we going to do with our toxic couches? I certainly don't feel like I want to, my couch is fairly new, but I'm not going to want to, in good faith, sell it to anybody. If I put it out on the street, someone will probably pick it up because it is in pretty good shape. But, I also would feel like that's probably not the best use of my couch either. So I struggle with what I'm going to do with my toxic couch. Do I send it to the dump? I'm not really sure.
We could put a sign on it that says this couch may cause cancer and see if someone takes it. Who knows? Wow.
Then maybe nobody will take it, right?
Yes. So how long before the fire retardants are released from the sofa? For instance, I bought it 10 years ago. Does it take 10 years for the fire retardant to break down or break apart from the foam, and then when you sit on it, is it then released? Does it take time, or is it something that the first day I bought it was perhaps the greatest day of off-gassing, or the highest day of off-gassing?
Yeah, I don't think that anybody has studied couches over their lifespans to really be able to answer that question. Most people keep their couches for a long time. Some people get their couches as hand-me-downs, so it's not uncommon, I think, for people to have couches that are 10, 15, 20 years old. And my understanding is that because these chemicals are semi-volatile, meaning that they evaporate slowly over time, the exposure is likely to be continuous. So we're probably not getting a big burst of exposure when we first bring it home, and we're probably not getting less exposure over time because they just continually are emitted as they evaporate from the foam. So it's most likely that you're being exposed as much now as you were when you first bought the couch.
So as much as you know, I'm sort of curious why you haven't gotten rid of your sofa that has the TB117 label on it. You obviously are a scientist and you've studied this. And is it something that concerns you every day, every time you sit on your sofa? Or do you have animals and kids?
Yeah, absolutely. So nobody's allowed to eat on my couch. And I've only recently found out that my couch contains this chemical and how much it is. I'm still trying to figure it out. But I know that if I got rid of it, and I wanted to have another couch in its place, it would be very expensive to replace because any couch that I purchased in California still has to meet that flammability standard. So the inner material, if it's polyurethane foam, which is what most couches are made of, will still be treated with flame retardant chemicals. And there's no label required, so I won't know unless I have the foam tested again what those replacement chemicals are. It is possible to buy couches that are filled with wool or polyester foam, and I know, some people have done that, but they're not readily available and they're not cheap. And because I know that this change in the standard is coming and, that in the next 9 months, we're hoping that new standard will be in place. I'm hoping that means that within a year, I could probably buy a couch that's more reasonably priced and that could replace my current couch. So in the meantime, I do some things in my house to try to reduce exposure to the chemicals that might be coming out of it. One is no eating or drinking on the couch. And second is because most of these chemicals come out and attach to dust particles, we do a lot of vacuuming and dusting, and we use a vacuum cleaner that has a HEPA filter so that when we vacuum, the dust isn't kicked up and spread around the house. And any dusting that we do of a hard surface, like a table or something that might be near the couch, is done with a damp cloth that prevents, again, the dust from being kicked up so that it can be inhaled. So you're not necessarily going to get a lot of exposure from just sitting on the couch and breathing. Most of the exposure is going to happen because you put your hand on it and you pick up some dust particles, and then you use your hands to eat, or if you're somebody who's a nail biter, you might put your fingers in your mouth. Or if you're a kid who explores your world by picking things up and putting them in your mouth, you might have some exposure. But you're probably not going to get a lot of inhalation exposure unless you're breathing dusty air. So if the dust is kicked up, you're probably going to get more exposure. Right. Unfortunately, the widespread use of these chemicals means that we're not only being exposed by our furniture, we're also now being exposed because these chemicals are contaminating our food supply. These chemicals are showing up in food now. Testing that's been done of fish and dairy products especially tend to be contaminated with flame retardant chemicals, and they're not intentionally being added to food. It's just because they're showing up in the environment, probably from the manufacturing, maybe from the disposal.
Would covering the mattress or covering a sofa that is laced with its fire retardant, would that reduce the exposure in the air to the fire retardant?
Possibly. You could possibly put a cover over the foam to try to reduce exposure. I don't know that there's any scientific research to back that up. Mattresses meet a different standard, and conventional mattresses, the box spring mattresses, actually aren't treated with a lot of these chemicals. So putting a dust mite cover on your mattress is to reduce dust mites, which is a good thing to do, especially if you have allergies, but it's not necessarily going to reduce exposure to flame retardants because they're not used in such heavy quantities in our mattresses, which is good news. I don't know about putting it as a covering on your couch because the thing about the chemicals is because they're semi-volatile, they're still going to evaporate and they're going to still, come in and be on the dust on the top layer that's exposed to the air in whatever room that you have it in. So I'm not sure that it would really reduce exposure significantly.
What can the listeners and what can I do to get more involved to try to get this moved forward, the legislation to get rid of fire retardants altogether?
It's actually not legislation that's happening in California right now. It's an administrative process. Governor Jerry Brown directed the agency, which is in charge of the flammability standards, to update the standard to be more protective of fire safety and also to reduce use of toxic chemicals. And so that process is working right now. The agency is developing the new standard, and it will be released for public comment sometime this winter. So listeners can follow NRDC on Facebook or follow my blog, which I can send you the link of, and get updates about what's happening with the flammability standard. We will probably send out action alerts and things for people to get in contact with the Bureau to let them know their thoughts and feelings and comments about the new standard. And then if we do any legislation that's related to flame retardant chemicals, we'll also be able to keep people updated that way. But I would say for your listeners who are really concerned about this, contacting your legislator, your California legislator, and letting them know about your concern and that you want to see action happening can only be helpful because it does help to raise awareness, especially in Sacramento, which is where all of the change is happening right now.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This is really eye-opening for me. I have to figure out what I'm going to do with my sofa now, and I'm sure you think about that every day as well.
I do.
Yeah.
When I figure it out, I'll let you know.
Well, thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, you too.
Hey,
Bye.
take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.